Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. I hope you had a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and I wanted to talk to you guys about Hydra Clash. Hydra Clash is coming out soon, sooner rather than later, and then over the course of these next couple days, you're going to see some videos that are going to get released that are going to talk about each of the different heads within different rotations and what that brings to the table and how to approach them, right? Today's head that I wanted to start off with, which is the number one, we're going to do a series of, I think there's at least 6 different heads that we have to take care of, if you count it, 6 in total. They're all very, very nuanced. They all have a specific mechanic in mind, and you're going to have to build a team that's going to be able to address all of them and maybe overlap some particular efficiencies just to make sure that you can clear the fight at a reasonable range. Now, before we get into each of the heads, I wanted to at least explain to you that the goal should always be that you obtain some kind of reward for your attempts, your actions, your efforts, right? And in particular, for each difficulty, there's a bunch of different damage threshold points that you need to be able to hit to obtain each of the different, difficulties. So, like, as you go up, it gets a little bit harder, and of course, you always want a top chest. You only have 3 keys to work within a given week. So, the highest difficulty, the highest chest is what you're looking to aim for, right? So, once you start getting down to, like, the final bracket, it can get pretty hard because there's a lot of nuance and a lot of mechanics that are involved inside of it. So, with that being said, let's get into the action. With that, the head of Decay. That is the first one we're going to work with, and I want to say it's amongst, if not the hardest or the most annoying to deal with out of all of them. So, what makes the head of Decay a problem? So, he attacks the enemy with the lowest HP, so he's trying to kill people. And he also applies a heal reduction, which means that if he doesn't kill you, he's going to make it even harder for you to keep him alive. And then, of course, whenever he is decapitated, heals enemy champions by 30%. So, that's a benefit for us if we can pop goes the weasel his head, okay? Now, with that being said, the big part about his mechanics, what makes him the most obnoxious, is Speed of Decay and Rotten Ward. Speed of Decay is to remove all debuffs from all heads, then he fills the turn meters of each of the heads by 30%. You don't want your enemy to go faster than you. You don't want your enemy to be ramping up more than you, and you also don't want your enemy to remove any or cleanse any of the debuffs that you're using to lock them down, right? So the Speed of Decay is no bueno. It's really probably the thing that shifts a pretty well organized team into one that falls apart very, very quickly. Rotten Ward removes all debuffs from one head selected. It's going to be the one that's going to be the lowest HP. Then he places a life barrier buff. I like to call this the egg buff. On them for 4 turns. This egg buff is protected, which means it can't be removed or stolen. And then when that egg buff it finally takes down to its final turn, so on each turn it goes down by 1 notch. Once it hits 0, the champion that gets it is going to be healed to full. So all the hard effort you were working to get that head popped and destroyed is going to go down the drain if you don't at least break through the egg before it takes down to its final turn. One thing I will say is that, like, this particular one is a bit of a nuance. I think the bigger one that's concerning for most players is Speed of Decay, because if you get one head that gets unruly, that gets a little bit freed from Rotten Ward, it's not too hard to lock it down, whereas you're trying to lock down multiple heads at the same time. You're always going to be going against at least 4 at any given point, so it's always a lot harder to manage all 4 heads at once when it comes comparatively to locking down maybe 1, right? The focus becomes a lot more strenuous, and your team gets taxed very, very aggressively, right? I will go ahead and talk about his Almighty Decay, which is his passive. Whenever an enemy champion's healed, destroys their max HP by 15%, so that's a negative for us if we're over-healing or just healing in general, trying to keep our team alive. It's like a mechanic that kind of cause like a slow enrage, to lack of better words, right? Now, it does cap at 25%, so you always have 75% of your HP, but if you tie that in tandem with some champions like Artec, you could see some issues where, I believe it's additive, so you have like the 25% and the 50% that he could do on his own from activations of HP burns. That could be a bit of a problem because he's running with very, very small pools of HP. There's a lot of nuance behind that, but you kind of get the idea, right? And the same notion, too, he's also able to recover that HP because he's able to apply HP burn. So, take in mind mechanics when you go in the mine. This is one of those mechanics that you have to kind of be conscious of, right? Miracle Healed or things that kind of restore destroyed HP are a way to kind of combat this. Those are little things that can help out a little bit, right? And then also, he decreases damage taken from poison. So I didn't mention this too much, but in this particular content, poison damage it used to be known as like one of the better, especially early game, debuffs to apply damage, like basically percent damage or tick damage or debuff damage, in the lack of better words, on bosses. And Hydra's basically 4 bosses within 1. That's not so much the case here, whereas like poison now is pretty much been neutered to a point where you're only doing 10% of the total damage you have on at least this head. And then in addition to that, decrease the damage all Hydra heads take from AoE attacks by 10%. So that means that if you have a team that's primarily AoE based, he's automatically going to reduce that total amount of damage by 10%. So you're only dealing 90% of that AoE's total damage to this head in particular. So something to keep in mind whenever you're building your teams out. If you need to make sure that you can do or handle one particular mechanic, which is going to be when the Hydra head tries to eat one of your heads, you need to break your champion free. If Decay so happens to be one of the ones that eats your champions or tries to eat your, he swallows your champion, you need to be able to focus on it. So maybe if you're relying on nothing but AoEs, you got to remember that you're losing 10% of your damage. So maybe min-maxing some, single target hitters with some AoE hitters may be opportunity. Finding that nice balance is going to be important. Then with that being said, damage from skills that scale based off enemy max HP cannot exceed 10%. So same with a lot of bosses that there's a 10% cap. This is also true for Hydra itself. And then, of course, as well, damage taken in from one tick of HP burns cannot exceed 20,000 HP. So there's a cap on HP burns as well. Seems like this guy is pretty mitigative, huh? Damage taken from reflected damage, War Mastery, or Giant Slayer Masteries cannot exceed 50% or 50,000, HP per attack. So in terms of like your damage output, this is very, very something you need to be very, very aware of. You know what I mean? Because it's like he has like a lot of mitigative pastures that can do it. Is that to say that any of these debuffs or approaches in terms of getting your damage outlets bad? I would say the answer is no, with the caveat that poison itself may not be the most recommended. I mean, if you're only doing 10% out of the total damage you would do, there's probably better damage outlets that you should look towards. And with that being said, there may be a particular champion that does put poisons on, but they provide something else, and that may still be of value. So you're not so much leaning into the damage aspect of that champion. You're more so going for the utility that provides. I'll give an example. Mithrala, very, very strong in Hydra, does poison, but in particular for Hydra, that's not her primary focus. She's more of a utility, with the hexing or with the cleansing side of things. She's providing a little bit more ease of access for your champions, a little bit better transitions through the fights, because, some put a lot of debuffs on, which we'll talk in those respective videos, right? With that being said, the last little bit, and this is the one that's kind of like full of detailed, is that the boss itself is immune to stun, freezes, sleep, block active skills, block passive skills, fear, true fear, and petrification. So Mytholo's Petrified doesn't work here. Also immune to HP exchanges, balancing effects, cooldown increasing, turn meter reduction. Those all do not work on her. So this is a Hydra head that is very mitigative. Likes to protect its team and cleanse its team. It's like it's basically the support of the Hydra heads, but also can be annoying in a debuff capacity too as well. So you got to basically look for things. If we're going to break it down per each ability, when you look at Agonizing Jaw, you're looking for champions that can provide some kind of cleanse, because this will go on. Block debuffs is good in Hydra if you can manage avoiding the other heads from manipulating or using, your block debuff to their advantage, right? For example, Mischief, which we'll talk about down in another video. But block debuffs would help with against this heal reduction. Cleansers, to give you an example, Tahanarak would be a good one. You could look at Mithrala's A3 as another way to mitigate it. And then, believe it or not, someone like Ugo, who I've been trying so hard to get, her A3 particularly has to do with removing heal reduction and then another debuff on top of that with some healing, right? So, like, there's some champions that are very, very good for this. Speed of Decay and Rotten Ward are buffs that they put on someone else. So unless you put some kind of controlling aspect to stop this this Hydra head from being able to do anything, it's going to happen, right? So the way that a lot of people approach handling the head of Decay particularly is to avoid the Hydra head from being able to do Speed of Decay and Rotten Ward all together. And the best way to do that is for looking through the means of Provoke. And basically, Provoke forces the head to only use their default ability, which is the heal reduction ability. You can manage and cleanse your own team more than it would be easier than having to put debuffs across the board again after you've already recently applied it. You're on cooldown, right? So it's a lot harder to be able to like keep these heads locked down if you don't have a means of being able to, take on keeping them down. You know what I mean? And that's the biggest thing, is that like the Decay head is going to try to stop you from keeping the heads locked down. And that's pretty much the main thing that you want to do about it. The key to it is definitely to approach it from this aspect of trying to find a permanent way of keeping that head provoked until you kill it, or a way that you're playing in mind to basically have all the other heads down before the head of Decay pops his abilities, right? Now, I'm going to highlight some champions in particular that are going to have some very good value in that regard, both from a from the debuff standpoint from his A1 as well as his as a provoker, right? So I personally, I've been trying to find like as many free-to-play options as possible. In particular, one that I know that everybody will get access to down the road that I think is a very, very valuable champion would be Vizix. And the reason why Vizix is so good is that her A3 has a provoke, which is very, very strong. And it also provides you a shield, so like whenever you are taking damage as Vizix, you're mitigating it. So like that's an already stand-up deal. In addition to that, she provides another form of utility, which is also valuable for the head of Decay, as well as other heads, is the decreased speed. Now, decreased speed is an underrated, if not one of the more higher desired abilities or debuffs in Hydra, because by slowing down the enemy, you're able to rotate into your abilities more often than the enemy does their turns, which ultimately leads to you cycling back into maybe maintaining that permanent provoke. Now, her A3, when fully booked, is going to be on a 3-turn cooldown. If you have her go at a speed that pretty much laps the boss already, in tandem with decreased speed, you might be able to do a rotation's worth of where you put the debuff on. Before he even gets his turn, you're cycling into more abilities, or you may have like a cleanser or resetter on your team. There are some team comps that may make that viable, where you can get back into provoke again. So once he has this turn, and it's if Vizix's turn again, he doesn't have a provoke, she can reestablish it and try to maintain that. So decreased speed is very valuable in that regard, because it's one step closer to basically allowing you to lap the enemy while you're also controlling it. So control is honestly going to be the name of the game when it comes to managing Hydra. The better you are control, the more efficient your damage is going to be able to get through and go through a battle of attrition. And that in particular is something that she shines very, very well in. I did talk about Mithrala, although she's not a provoker from a cleanser standpoint from that A1. Being able to remove all debuffs, placing a strength and a shield buff is a blessing in the regard that you can kind of re-stabilize your team. Maybe the champion that was lowest, that got hit with a heal reduction, is one step away from dying, but you're going to have your Pythion, for example, or your Aniri, or some champion that's going to heal your team. They're going to want to have that heal hit the champion with the lowest HP, and because that heal reduction's on, they're not going to be able to do it. Well, Mithrala can say, nope, we're cleaning that off the board. Let them get their heal. Let them cook, And that may be fortuitous. Now, in the same tandem, champions that can overlap with other debuffs that are going to be established in Hydra as we go through this series are going to be very ideal. For example, from a cleansing standpoint, Tahanarek's very, very good with her passive, and then on a much more lower term in terms of like viability, Doom Priest also does something very similar. But Tahanarek stands out a little bit better. One, she's a Void champion, but also she provides some buffs that are very, very good for you to pick up momentum, in addition to some other buffs that we'll talk for efficiency down the road. Now, decreased speed still a thing at play, right? And then, of course, these other buffs which help you take less damage and whatnot makes her a very, very standout champion, in tandem with the main priority factor of what we're looking for at Decay, which is that mitigative cleansing standpoint, right? Now, I will go ahead and show some champions like Pythion, for example, we talked about. He is a very, very good champion that provides healing as well as that cleansing aspect in his A2. And block debuffs is very valuable. But whenever you're going against particular heads, like the Head of Mischief, for example, that could be very, very dangerous, because they could take that from you, and then they could apply it to their team, which would end up going on the Head of Decay, and then you can't provoke, right? I'll go ahead and go on reference and talk about some other champions that have provoked, since we're talking and focusing on Decay. In particular, some very, very well-established champions that could do a lot is going to be Krisk. Of course, I know this is very, very high-end. I'm going to bring it down as we go along, so hang in there with me. Provoke is very, very strong, right, in that regard, so you have to worry about... you don't have to worry about your team, because they're going to get the increased defense and speed, so that's going to help them pick up their pace, but you're also locking down the enemy. And then when it's fully booked down, it's on a 3-turn cooldown. So we're looking at 3-turn cooldown champions as kind of like the standard here, right? And that's not even talking about what else he could do to the table, but in particular with the focus with Decay, he provides a lot in that regard because of what he does, not only from his A3, but he also has a lot of capabilities of punishing the enemy when they do start getting their turns, right? He also provides a shield, a lot of ways to not only provide mitigation for your team, but also to lock down the enemy. And that's pretty ideal when you're looking for multiple things in champions, right? Now, I will go on record and say that, like, as you start going down in terms of your like epics and lowers, you can start telling that they're only either really good at this one thing, or they don't spread on others. There are some exceptions to this rule. I did talk about Ugo, for example. She's a very, very good champion that provides not only that reduction removal, which allows your team to survive more. She also heals them, and then an extra random debuff gets removed. You know, there's going to be other heads that do debuffs, right? And then if she's the last one standing, you know, as a Hail Mary, your big bounce back, you know, in the event that, you know, you weren't able to mitigate some damage from like Wrath, for example, or some kind of mechanic caused your team to end up getting like pretty much almost wiped, she has a revive. So like that A3 alone is one way to answer the heal reduction from Decay, right? Now, with that being said, in terms of provokers, it gets a little bit more harder to pinpoint and lock down, but I did want to talk about some options that are a little bit more accessible. Like, for example, Duck. Although I don't have it myself, he's actually a pretty strong champion. You can set him up to be tanky as long as he's got his provoke. It is on a 4-turn cooldown, so it's not as effective. I remember how I talked about epics and legendaries, the difference as you go from like the quality of your champion. Their kit also kind of becomes a little bit more nuanced, but he does make up for in other ways, like, you know, mitigative damage or enabling your damage, right? The same thing with maybe making it harder for like the mischief to steal buffs, or in general, you know, provoking so that you can lock down the enemy. He's not a bad option. We also had a couple new champions that would be very, very good. I won't say new, but like champions that they had some events for recently that were kind of nice. Like Skaramis, for example, who also has a provoke with counterattack and a continuous heal on himself. This is booked down to a 3-turn cooldown, so you see that 3 turns. That's a good W. And then of course decrease attack when he hits all enemies. And then, of course, he has a chance to stun, which is not relevant for the course of this particular fight. But in general, this is a champion that does have some value in terms of being able to be a provoker, right, on a 3-turn cooldown. And you're looking for stuff like that. That's the things you're aiming for. Now, I did want to talk about some more meta-style comps. We did talk about Chris, who's really, really good. I wanted to highlight one particular champion that I look very, very fondly of. And I did a showcase with, the primary focus was Necmo, but Contra was also a shining star inside that composition. And the reason why is that not only does she provide a lot of buffs to all enemies, but in tandem with that, the more you debuff a champion, once you hit at least 5 or more debuffs, there's a 75% chance that when she gets her turn, she's provoking. So as a provoke option, it's very, very good. And she can also place debuffs on weak hits. So like when you get exposed to other heads like Blight, for example, who puts up a poison cloud, makes it very difficult for you to put out those type of debuffs, because it's pretty much like almost like a block debuff that's irresistible, right? Without on hit damage type things, because a lot of times it forces like weak hits, which means that the buff doesn't land because you weak hit, right? So like, although her A3 may not be on, because you had enough debuffs by the time that hits, she's able to sneak this through because it's not an on hit proc. It's just automatically like kind of similar to like Geomancer. Geomancer can put his A3 on any head that has like Poison Cloud, including Decay. So if you want to get 2 of the 5 debuffs on there, he could put the HP burn and weaken without hitting the boss, and it will still apply as long as he supersedes the enemy's resistance. Which is the next point that I'm going to bring to your attention. As you progress in this game, you're going to have different difficulties that you can go against. Right now, at the time of this recording, we are in rotation 4, so I'll use that as the reference point. The Head of Decay at normal, and we're going to go through each one of them. It starts off with a resistance of 120, which means that you need to have about 145 accuracy to be able to land your debuffs, such as Provoke, on the boss. The same is also true for heal reduction. If you are trying to maybe mitigate the fact that you're so dependent on your cleansers, and if they get eaten, it's so hard for you to bounce back, having enough resistance may not be a bad option either, right? So, you know, the Head of Decay has 190 accuracy, so you would need 295 at a minimum to be able to resist his debuffs that are put onto you. So, with that being said, he's also at a speed of 190, which makes him decently fast at a normal stage. 200s being like one of the big stepping stones or benchmarks that you would hit in terms of your speeds. So like as you hit 200, you'll notice that your gear will either be stressed or you'll start feeling a lot more comfortable, which means you're going to start pushing into the next range. I talked about this in all my videos about like hitting certain breaking points, about what's indicative of your gear progression. You know, the better your gear gets, the more easier it is for you to have better stats within certain speed brackets, right? So around the 100 or the 200, excuse me, range, or maybe even a little bit higher than that, is pretty much what you're looking for like the normal range of it. It does go up as you also go up in difficulty. As we're looking hard, the Head of Decay also goes up in speed, now looking at 200 as a minimum, and then of course 170 resistance and 220 accuracy, which means that your stats also have to go up in tandem if you're trying to resist or if you're trying to land your debuffs, right? Now, it looks like it goes up in increments until you start hitting Brutal. Brutal's a big breakpoint about whether or not you're going to be able to do a lot more. And if you pay attention, 235 resistance means you need 260 accuracy. It starts picking up. Same thing with their accuracy, 265 accuracy, which means you need 370 resistance. That starts to become a lot more challenging. Now, I will say the difference between Nightmare and Brutal are a little bit less of a gap compared to Hard and Brutal, but it's still significant nevertheless. One thing I will give you a reference point if you're using like a Mischief tank or something like that. Pay attention to these numbers that you're going to have to hit in terms of breakpoint. You'd be surprised at how close some of them are. And you may want to consider, depending on where you're at in the game, to either prepare for the next difficulty. And the numbers may not be that they're very comparable. They may be like 5 points on. I'll give you an example. If you look at Brutal's Mischief, what you need for resistance is 450 because it has 345 accuracy. When you look at Nightmare, you only need 455 because the accuracy is only at 350. So instead of just going for the 450, you might as well go ahead and go for the 455, so that you can already be ready for Nightmare. And it's only that difference. As always, take into account your gear, your progression, and that'll define where you're at that point in time of the game. And remember, it's a marathon. It's not a race. You're not trying to get there as quickly as possible. But the Head of Decay is one of many ways that you will have to manage and deal with you know, resisting or cleansing or provoking the enemy, which in this case, we're talking about the Head of Decay. You need to be able to manage his head, because if this guy cleanses everybody, you're in for a world of hurt, or you're in for a world of where your team is just being locked down in response because they're able to take your buffs and then keep themselves and protect themselves, you know. Decay and Mischief are two of the most annoying heads, and when they're paired together, it's very disastrous if you're not careful with it. So having these champions in mind are very, very important. I'm going to give you some other unorthodox builds so we can kind of keep the momentum along. Although I'm not going to say their efficiency is super high. Like, for example, I actually have to give a special nod to Black Knight. He has a 75% chance of provoking on his A1, so you could just spam his A1 on the Head of Decay and hope that lands. As long as you got the accuracy requirements, it's always going to be a 75% chance. There is that 25% chance failure, and there's also that 3% chance failure no matter what. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're dealing with your team composition. But maybe with him, you know, whenever he's not provoking, like you got the Head of Decay dead and you killed him, you popped the head, maybe during that downtime he could play more of a supportive role, increase defense and maybe some continuous heals. Or he could try going a little bit more damage oriented with his A3 or his A1 for that matter to try to get a little bit more damage in. He's not a bad option, but he is one that's a little bit on the lower side of the totem pole, right? Now, with that being said, there's one other thing I want to give you guys when it comes to the rotations. I actually went ahead and did this in advance so you can kind of see it. Basically, every rotation has a different affinity, and that's also going to change the likelihood of one champion being more effective than the others. If you can kind of tell, it goes Force, Magic, Spirit, and then Force, Magic, Spirit again. So rotation 1 through 3 is Force, Magic, Spirit, and then 4 through 5 is Force, Magic, Spirit. So it kind of seems to have like a little bit of an order, right? And with that being said, you don't want to put a magic-based provoker against a force-based Head of Decay, right? So it's very, very important to kind of keep that in mind when you're doing that, which is why you'll start seeing some champions like, for example, Contra would not be good against the 3rd and the 6th rotation, in the sense that being able to apply a provoke if it was an on hit, as an example, I'm just using this as a hypothetical, if she were to likelihood to depend on that, it would be less likely to land. Now, thankfully, her kit in particular says she can land debuffs on weak hits. That's why I said I was using that example. But if we want to bring it back, talking about Black Knight. Black Knight is a force-based champion who has to do an on hit to try to provide that provoke, right? So rotation 3 and 6, this is no bueno. And then I'll also give an example of another champion that may be a little bit more accessible, who is actually very, very meta in Hydra, is Husk, for example, right? He has a 45, or excuse me, a 35, 40%. Let's do the math here. 20, 30, 40, right? So 40% chance to land a debuff provoke. Although it's not very high, it is one of those things that you can use as like an off tank or an off provoker. You know, he is primarily a damage dealer with his enemy max HP A2. But he can also facilitate the role of like a secondary provoker in the event that like maybe your first provoker didn't land a debuff, or your first provoker was you know, eaten by one of the Hydra heads and you need to break them out. So during that period you want to keep your, you know, the enemy locked down, get that one extra A1 off, and maybe that chance to land that provoke. You'd be surprised. This actually surprises people at how efficient this is, even though it's at a low percentage. So he's a little underrated in that regard. So he kind of provides the role of like an off provoker. You can use him as a primary provoker, but like I would be aware of the fact that this is a 40% chance to land, is that it's going to land less likely than you think. So having a better provoker in general would be a much more better focus, right? And then in tandem with that being a damage dealer. So you kind of see how like he facilitates two roles, DPS as well as a secondary provoker. You're looking for champions that can kind of do multiple things. And as you see each of these mechanics play out, you'll notice that there's going to be some champions that stand out amongst other ones that could do multiple things, right, and do them very effectively. And that's when you see the quality of that champion improve in terms of their value in Hydra. And to be honest with you, there are going to be some champions that stand out amongst the best. They are undefeated. They are peerless when it comes to being able to do this one mechanic, which is why they're so meta. Whereas there's others who could do like a splash of things very, very well, and that's why they're also meta. So like understanding the concept. Like for example, Acrizia is by far one of the best damage dealers, especially when you start getting against enemies that have high HPs. So brutal and nightmare territory type content for Hydra. Any max HP reigns supreme, and she's able to do it consistently across the board with every single one of her abilities, making her a top tier damage dealer. That's why she's meta. Whereas like Husk, although he's not as efficient in that regard in terms of being able to consistently do any max HP, he does have his moments of brilliance on a 4-turn cooldown. Maybe in reflex he can also cycle into that ability more often, and then he complements with like a provoke, for example, which is like fantastic for managing decay, right? So like those are some champions that kind of give you some ideas of like how you can handle it. I'll give you another one that's a good throwaway. Provoke. Vogoth hits all enemies, so at the very least being able to provide that decreased attack is valuable. And then the chance of being able to provide that provoke, which is when it's fully booked, is a 75% chance on a 3-turn cooldown. Yes, it's not a 100% chance, but it's a chance nevertheless that you need to make sure you're managing, right? And then it complements that by putting decreased attack across the all enemies, right? So that's good value that you get from the Vogoth against the other heads, or against the heads in general. And then in tandem with that, he provides, you know, heals, so he's also kind of like a pseudo healer in the sense that as he takes damage, he's healing, you know, based off of a percentage, which is 25 from boss attacks. He's healing by 25% of that back to the team, right? And then whenever he's attacked, he has a chance of putting a leech debuff on the attacker for 2 turns. If it's provoked, then you also have a 70% chance of increasing the cooldown of a random skill. This is not as likely of a value there, but increasing the chancing of being able to provide leeches and whatnot, that's another little complementary way for you to keep your team alive, right? So there's some value there in terms of like an epic champion that could do it for you. Additionally, and I'm going to talk about one that I probably wouldn't go out of my way to use initially, but you got to work with what you got. I'll go ahead and break it down towards Gnarhorn in terms of a rare. This champion is phenomenal with a 3-turn cooldown. It is a provoke for 1 turn, which is also kind of like a thing that you have to watch out for. Increased defense here, which means that if you don't have any other increased defenses on your team, you may be able to build him in a way that also makes him a mischief tank in a sense. So, and when we do a breakdown of that video, you can kind of see why we kind of nodded to that, right? But yeah, those are some champions that do it. Now, I'm going to talk about one other final thing, and this is how you can kind of prepare for it. And this is one champion that everybody will have access to. And believe it or not, it's not a champion, it's a set bonus, and that is Provoke. Provoke set is actually one that you can apply on almost literally anyone. Ideally, I think the way that you want to do it is that you want to provide it on someone who can either multi-hit or someone who does like a lot of AoE. And the reason why is that like if you're going against like Decay and the Wrath of Head, for example, we're in the middle of rotation 4, you got Head of Decay, Mischief, and Wrath. Wrath sometimes provoke, maybe you don't have enough resistance, and you know you're using, like, for example, we did a showcase on him not too long ago, and I mentioned this. Necmo, for example, who does nothing but AoE damage, right? Attack all enemies for his two main damage dealing abilities. Even though he may be provoked over there to hit the Head of Wrath during that one time, that Decay still needs to be that Head of Decay still needs to be provoked. So whenever he does his AoE hit, he's automatically getting that chance proc on the Head of Decay, right? And that's where Provoke set may become valuable. Or an example, we're gonna go back to someone who does provoke. Dark Elves has Physics, right? And Physics only has this on a 1 turn. Maybe you don't have her fully booked, like me, for example, I don't. But you have 2 other abilities that do damage. Maybe put her in a Provoke set, so even if she lands this and she's on cooldown, you know, by her doing the rest of her kit or just actively pressuring the Decay, she has some chances to on-hit for the boss, right? And I'm going to use Coronar for this example just so that you can kind of get like some validity behind it. But like champions that do counterattacking, as long as a metric has been fulfilled, like for example, decrease attack, decrease defense, decrease speed, all very good debuffs in Hydra, right? So you're going to try to find ways to put them in or inject them into your team composition. Means that like even if you don't build him as fast as you want him to, like for example, mine's with Hydra battle bonuses and whatnot, he's only at 195 speed. So like how am I going to be able to maintain that provoke he has on his A2? Well, besides depending on this, I went ahead and added provoke set, you know, so that whenever he does counterattack, he's hitting all enemies with his A1, right? So there you go. You kind of see some synergy. Provoke set plus counterattacking A1 means that whenever I'm getting hit and they got these debuffs on them, I'm getting a chance to provide provoke. And believe it or not, it's actually pretty substantial. Now, I would also say this, ideally, you want to look for abilities to, or masteries maybe to complement that. And I use this for right now just as a testing format, maybe because a little bit lesser of a mandatory requirement as my provoke gear gets better optimized or Coronar gets booked. You know, we'll have to see as we play test and develop it ourselves. But you know, Fearsome Presence in tandem with the Provoke set means that you have not only the 5% from Fearsome, but you also have that 30%, now a 35%. If you thought about some of the champions we were talking about, you know, 40% Husk or you know, somewhere around those lines with that chance being around the 30 percentile or 40 percentile, 45 percentile is pretty much the equivalent to it. So without having to inject that champion into play, you can get it from a set bonus, right? And that's one way that you can kind of help do damage. And here's another thing to say, right? Just because I have him in kind of like a high resistance, my intent was to make him a Mischief tank as well as a Provoke tank for both Mischief and Decay. You know, champions that that don't necessarily benefit from having, you know, high resistance, or you want them as like primarily damage dealer, like Razavart, for example, who does do 2 AoE all enemy hits, right? You can still build them in Provoke, but you could build them with stats that are damage oriented, your crit damage gloves, your crit rate gloves, depending on where you're at, right? Attack percent chest, you know, as long as you facilitate hitting that, you know, that percent or that 4-piece bonus so that you can start getting extra provokes, doesn't hurt, you know? So like Husk, for example, or another enemy max HP champion that's also pretty good in general would be like Royal Guard, who does do AoE, or at the very least, you know, 4 times at random. At the very least, you have a chance there. Or even in his A1 on hit damage, you know, you're able to apply that provoke maybe for that extra chance just to lock him down, and that one turn may be all it needs for that real provoker that you're working with to get their cycle back in and they can execute, right? As always, speeds and other mechanics and builds are going to play a part into your efficiency with it. But the idea for Decay and the summary of words is find cleansers to manage that heal reduction, and then, of course, or prevent it with block debuffs with a caveat of being careful with mechanics from other bosses. And then, of course, provoke. Make sure that guy can't move without looking at the champion that you have provoking at him, and then he can't cleanse. So lock him down and then let him cook. And with that being said, I hope this video finds you successful going into the future Clash, the Hydra Clash that's coming up. And we will be continuing this series with the next head that's going to be coming up. I hope you're looking forward to it. But don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. If I missed something, let me know. I'm all ears. We're open to a discussion. At the end of the day, we're trying to help everybody improve and become better at playing this game and make it more competitive, a little bit more enjoyable, a little bit more enticing. It's always great to see people break through and find new ways to beat mechanics that have existed for a good period of time. So with that being said, I hope you like this video. Like, comment, subscribe, and always remember, stay ascended.
Got the